Thank you everyone for joining us. I am the assistant curator of native plants here at Denver Botanic Gardens, and I call myself an ecological horticulturist. I have been here at the gardens for about 4 years now, and I've presented with Waterwise Central or Waterwise and Resource Central the last 2 years. But in the past, I've presented more on best practices for Western gardens, which I'm sure you can find in the archive somewhere. But today we're going to dive in and take it a little further and dive into the ecology of why this type of design matters. Often in garden design, we hear the phrase sense of place. And that refers to creating a garden that feels anchored in its environment or emulates a natural area or feels like the West at large. People say that when they come here to the gardens, what a sense of place we have. And while that is a valuable way to think about it, I think it can feel kind of restrictive to creating a garden with a specific outcome. And I want to empower you all to sort of throw that idea out the window and know that a garden for the future can look like anything you want it to. We can use local ecology to create dynamic gardens, but they can look like so many different things depending on your aesthetic goals. Most importantly, it's about how these spaces function rather than how they look. And so I'm curious as we move through this presentation, what does a garden for the future mean to you? How do you think about the space you're creating, the legacy you'll leave in the gardens and spaces you touch? So I'm going to dive right in. Today, we're going to get into a little bit of like, why am I here telling you about this and why should we care? We're going to talk a little bit about the mindset required to go into this type of gardening, which I think many of you are well on your way if you're attending these seminars. We're going to get into a little bit of the local ecology that inspires these designs. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks and plant lists for doing it and a little bit more heady theory at the end. So starting off, why me? So I moved here. I've been an East Coast girl my whole life. Grew up in Delaware, studied in Virginia, lived in Boston for 6 years, very tied to the Appalachian Mountains and the coast. Very lush, temperate environments. But I moved here 4 years ago, having never been in the plains or the desert ever. And I was instantly obsessed. As many before me have discussed, there is a mysterious allure to the expanse of steppe regions. It feels ancestral. These high and dry areas encompass grasslands, shrublands, deserts, and montane environments. They're a vast and precious storehouse of species diversity and species richness, often for exceeding that of temperate areas, which is contrary to what most people believe. The rich, lush forests of the East must be more biodiverse because there's more bio material, right? Biomass. But truly, the grasslands and deserts have a unique place for species richness and endemism based on adaptations things need to live in these environments. Um, but I'm entranced with these areas because they are so attached to human history. We evolved on the grasslands. We came out of the forest and onto the grasslands and evolved into the human species. And for most of our history, grasslands are what sustained us. The forbs, the herbs and grasses that we foraged, as well as the ungulates that allowed us to survive and thrive. And it wasn't until we discovered maritime climates and their a little bit more consistent rainfall patterns that we started to really colonize more temperate maritime environments. But as I was saying, I moved here and as an East Coast native plant nut, I loved ferns. I knew a ton about hydrangeas. And then I inherited three of the driest gardens here at Denver Botanic Gardens. My imposter syndrome set in immediately. And so I hustled to visit as many of these dryland environments as I could find. And so here's some photos from all over the West of my first few years here on plant collection trips and personal road trips and all of the things. So I've spent a lot of time botanizing in the deserts the past 4 years. So just to give you an idea, these green dots all represent areas I've visited in the last few years to get to know these plants and these environments and why I'm qualified enough to sit here and tell you about them today. And then these circles all represent kind of the areas that my gardens here at the Denver Botanic Gardens represent or contain plants from our living collections from these environments. And so I've really tried to get into a lot of these areas where we might be able to look for plants that would be applicable to our climate here in Denver. Here's a few of my gardens. These are the pictures in front of you are from Dryland Mesa Garden and Sacred Earth Garden. And these are both unirrigated gardens. They were installed in Dryland Mesa was installed in the early 90s and Sacred Earth in the early 2000s, 20, 30 years old respectively. There is no irrigation in these spaces. So anything that plants are getting is hand water for the first few months. Then I pretty much forget about them. And they're like, oh crap, have I watered them in months? And so it is truly survival of the fittest. And they are remarkable, beautiful spaces. Um, so I just want to orient us again as we get into our ecology. This is an aridity map of the United States showing the amount of rainfall that these regions get on an annual basis. And so you can see those same red circles there again. These are some of the driest areas of the country, averaging from like 5 inches of rain to the wettest areas on a wet year, maybe 20, 23 inches of rain. Um, and as you know, we live smack dab in the middle of this. So it's incredibly relevant for us to look to these ecological systems for inspiration when we're designing our gardens. Um, but that brings me to my next point. It's like, why should we care? Why are we here? And I want to talk a little bit about the urban heat island effect. I hope you all have heard of this, but if you haven't, it is the theory that, well, it's not theory, it's proven that our urban communities have incredibly warmer surface temperatures than their wild counterparts, due in part to paving and dark roofs and dark asphalt. And just the amount of buildings to vegetation. We know that plants cool our environment. And so the urban heat island effect can cause surface temperatures to reach 150 degrees in some places of the desert Southwest. It causes increased energy across our urban environments up to 9% per 2-degree increase. So if you think about, we're seeing a 10-degree increase in some of our urban areas, that is a huge increase in our energy consumption. This leads to elevated emissions, which leads to poor air quality and ground level ozone and all of the things that we here in Denver are familiar with when it comes to our air quality. It also compromises human health in turn, obviously, and impairs our water systems and water quality because when the surface temperature is hotter, if we do get any rain, we're seeing tons of runoff and chemicals that come off of a hotter surface running into our local streams and waterways. So I want to point out those red circles on the map. And so those are rural areas, ponds, and parks that you see what we would hope to see in a more regular surface temperature. And so you can see how even our urban residential zones are still very high up there in our surface temperature graph. And so we want to do as much as we can to bring those surface temperatures down to like where those red circles are. And that means making sure that all of our yards, all of our parking lots, all of our roofs are green, are planted with things that can provide us services like cooling the air, providing oxygen, cleaning the air. And so it's, this is a daunting endeavor. This is a scary effect that happens, but luckily the solution is easy and it's planting flowers. Um, so this is why we should care. This is another reason why we should care. I think those of us in this space all have tons of frustration with hearing the term xeriscaping. And so if you're not familiar, the term xeriscaping, XERI, refers to using plants of low water needs and low water communities. It is not xeriscaping, contrary to popular belief and things like this. And, these are some photos from Reddit and the internet of people being like, I just finished my yard. I'm so excited with my xeriscape. And we really want to work to dispel this rumor. Um, We're not talking about lawns on sidewalks or boulder fields with a few non-native grasses planted in a row like we often see, like these. We've all been there. It's every strip mall, it's every parking lot across America. Sad trees in sad conditions with big rocks underneath. And my biggest complaint with these systems, and I live in an apartment complex in Uptown and it surrounds our building, is boulders with trees planted in them, and then irrigation that runs all night long, and there's no lawn, and it's just running right into the street. The heads are facing the wrong direction. And so we're literally taking clean drinking water and spraying it onto our asphalt all night long, all across the city, all across America. And so I would love to see that change. And that's why I'm really passionate about health strips and urban spaces and making them no water zones where we can have thriving communities. Like this, for example, this was a parking swale. This is back east, so you'll notice the plant palette is a little bit different. But this was a bioswale parking garden at Heritage Museums and Gardens where I worked on Cape Cod. And this was truly amazing. We took a gravel lot with horrible compaction and turned it into a remarkable native plant garden. This one is more local. This is up in Lyons, Colorado, the Lyons Municipal Building. And it's bee balm and coreopsis that you'll see here. And again, it's another parking swale that gathers water coming off of our surface lots. So our parking lots could instead look like this and be thriving microcosms, providing services for humans and stewardship for our non-human ecosystems. Um, Greening our urban spaces will literally help save the planet, and that feels like a win-win. Here's some of those spaces I was referencing, those urban areas that are just, maybe forgotten about. Maybe we don't have the maintenance to take care of them, but I'm going to make the case we should all guerrilla sow native plant seeds around the city. And instead, they could look like these. And who wouldn't want that? This is one in northern Colorado, less of a native palette and more of a low water palette, but the colors and textures are amazing. It's low to the ground, so there's still really great road visibility, which can often be a concern. Um, and I want to just chime in real quick for those of you who may be worried. I do not have the labels of plant names on my slides, but when I share the presentation with Resource Central and they share it with you, I will go back and add all the plant names. So if you have any specifics of which plants you're seeing, I will add them before we share these with you. So I just want to reiterate, these are some views from our drought tolerant gardens, and this is what those spaces could look like, right? Tons of color, season long bloom, tons of texture, all cold hardy plants and things that really require incredibly lower water compared to our lawns or our bare ground. But to do this, it's going to require a cultural mindset shift. And I know a lot of us here are already there. And it feels like, we're trending in the right direction. The the government is subsidizing this in cities across America, but it is not mainstream yet. It is still an uphill battle in our mainstream landscaping industry, and really reaching landscape architects and designers and engineers to help them understand what ecology can mean in these spaces. So I'm going to get into the mindset shift a little bit and keep going a little bit on this tirade about the green lawn hangover, just in case you're still unsure. But what is the lawn? Why do we have the lawn? Is it a relic of power dynamic, of wealth and aristocracy? Here you see a European estate on the left and an estate in Cherry Hills, Colorado on the right. This is still happening. These lawns are still being planted. One of my favorite sayings is the the lawn should be an area rug and not a wall-to-wall carpet. So when we think about lawns in our spaces, it's not that we need to get rid of them completely, but it means we need to be really intentional about why we have them and what we're using them for. And often that means we just need a little postage stamp where we can play and picnic and, you know, sit around and have our children play safely. But it does not mean we need wall-to-wall carpeting of this highly resource intensive dead zone. Um, they were an efficiency solution in the post-World War II industrial boom when we saw suburban developments happening. Um, the lawns were a way for things to look uniform and easy. This was the era when we really moved away distance gardening and the cottage garden and growing our own food, and instead had the global industrial grocery movement where we could buy all our food in stores. And that is when we continued to see a shift into lawn. But are they also a wasteland, a dead zone, a dumping ground for chemicals and fertilizers, where weeds flourish, the competition isn't there? Um, they're all of the above. And so this is the average American landscape with new builds today. It's still happening. And these, you can't call them ecosystems. They're dead zones. They're monocultures. They require tons of inputs, tons of chemicals and time, and really represent exerting control over the land. Um, and similarly, in universities across the country, we still equate these higher learning universities with these classic Ivy Leagues and European models where the lawn really is a symbol of this wealth and aristocracy and high level. So while we need quads and while we need lawn space, we could have a lot more borders and edges that involve other plantings. So one of my favorite um, influencers in the space of conservation and botany is Joey Santori of Crime Pays But Botany Doesn't. If you're not familiar, he is constantly talking about these topics in Central Texas. And so he has really popularized the Kill Your Lawn movement as well. And then the namesake for my presentation, Higher and Drier, comes from Bob Knoll's very famous 2008 book about gardening in the West called High and Dry. And he really talks about how this quote, it's odd to think that garden styles are the result of a sort of manifest destiny. And he's not wrong. These styles came with us from the East as we settled the country, and we tried to bring trees from the East and plants from Europe that are very popular in the eastern half of the country, and make them work here in our Intermountain West climate, which of course does not work for the most part and really leaves our landscapes feeling uninspired. I loved Panayotti's quote there as well. Not sure if it's still true today, but I doubt that there's anywhere on the globe where urban and suburban gardens are so utterly different from our natural environment. And lastly, on my lawn tirade, lawns contribute to flooding on a vast scale. And if you think about how much of our environment, urban and suburban, are covered in turf grasses, the compaction that they really hold is remarkable. And when we talk about prairie ecosystems, grassland ecosystems, even desert ecosystems, the soil truly acts as a sponge and holds that water for months, and replenishes our groundwater supply. Okay, moving on. I'm off my tirade about lawns. Everybody kill your lawn. I know that's why we're all here. But the other piece of the mindset shift I want to talk about is moving from a mindset of control to one of more collaboration. And Robin Wall Kimmerer is one of our favorite voices in the ethnobotanic and ecological space. And I really relate to her quote here, especially in these incredibly dark and trying times that we're living through now. I find that gardening and ecological stewardship in particular, making those connections, seeing a bug on a plant, yesterday I saw ladybug eggs in the garden and ladybug pupae eating aphids off the sagebrush, and just those moments of connection really inspire hope that we can repair and there is a future moving forward. Um, One of my favorite quotes from Robin Wall Kimmerer, not up on the screen, speaks to this hierarchy of beings. And one thing that we have really come to believe in modern day is that humans are at the top of the hierarchy. But our indigenous brothers and sisters and ancestors will tell us that that is, of course, not true. We are not the darling of creation. The plants are not at the bottom. In native ways of knowing, human people are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. We say that humans have the least experience with how to live and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among the other species for guidance. Their wisdom is apparent in the way that they live, and they teach us by example. All of the other beings have been on Earth far longer than we have been and have had time to figure things out. So, one thing we can do as we make this mindset shift is to realize we have so much to learn as we watch and steward these garden spaces. One of my favorite ways to think about this is the relationship between Indigenous communities and ecological knowledge with bison and grasslands. And so we have this Rosalind Lapierre is her name, who's pictured in this photo, and she has studied how Indigenous communities have been managing, cultivating, harvesting, setting fire to grassland ecosystems for thousands of years, and how once we have used fire to manage a grassland, to help maintain it as a grassland, we can control where the bison move. The bison create wallows and disturbance that allow novel plant communities to thrive. They create microhabitats where succession can happen. Um, and then the indigenous communities can move through and harvest, and they can harvest the plants and herbs, the bison, birds, grass. It is all there, and it's a really beautiful relationship just to keep in mind as we move through this ecological horticulture journey. The other piece is rethinking the way that we think about bugs. It's reimagining our relationship with bugs, whether you like them or not. They make the world go round, and we're losing them at an unprecedented rate. Since the early 90s, we have probably lost close to half of the insect species on the planet. And one of my favorite facts from Doug Tallamy and his research with Lepidoptera, or moths and butterflies, is that it takes 4,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of chickadees, was the species they studied. And so they might have 2 to 3 clutches in a season. So that's about 12,000 caterpillars for one breeding pair of chickadees. And so it's a great example of the gardens that we need to create and the way we need to think about plants feeding insects and then insects feeding birds and so on up the food chain. And I love this quote. John Little is a designer in the UK who specializes in brownfield remediation and really designing these post-human gardens in spaces that have been abandoned and forgot about, using old cars, gabion walls, recycled materials, and letting nature thrive, not remediating the soil, not amending the soil, but choosing species that can thrive in these spaces and really create complexities. And so I think he hits the nail on the head, which is if we valued gardeners and people who steward these spaces more, I'm a little biased here, that it would really change the world instead of really valuing, infrastructure development. Let's focus on the green spaces. Um, and so in those photos at the bottom there, you see in the center is leaf cutter bee activity. And so I planted some species from the prairie last year that we collected in Eastern Colorado. And within like a week of planting them, I saw these exact little holes on them. And I was like, oh my gosh, these are leaf cutter bees. And so all season, I saw those bees foraging on the pollen of these plants, cutting the leaves out. And they use those leaf parts to seal the holes they make in cavities, like the picture on the left. A lot of our native bees and pollinators nest in wood cavities like that. Um, so, as ecological horticulturists, we have to provide this food and we have to resist the urge to call them pests and to see this as a downside in the garden. Oh no, they're eating the leaves of my plant and it looks ratty. That is exactly what we're here for, and we should be joyed to see evidence of those things happening. Um, as ecological horticulturists, we're acutely aware of these relationships, but that is not the case for landscape architects and engineers. However, we don't need to have intimate knowledge of these relationships. We just need to choose plants local to our region. Um, I keep thinking of the phrase, if you build it, they will come, when I think about this work from Field of Dreams. And truly, that is the case. If we select local plants native to our region in the desert Southwest, we will inherently be providing food and shelter and nesting for our local wildlife as well. But that's not the only thing. We do need to adjust our style of gardening a little bit. So, and I'll take questions after this last piece here. But I also just want to mention many of our native pollinators, which includes solitary bees and wasps, so wasps that don't live in colonies or nest in the ground. So that picture on the right is a picture of some open, bare ground with a little bit of sand, and you can see right in that hole is a little bee. I think it's a bombus species, but I'm not sure. And so in all of my areas of bare ground throughout the garden, I see these holes happening all the time, and it is so beautiful to watch them. Okay, so moving on, the Dance of the Dead. Um, this is an entire season of interest, right? I think we often, traditional styles of gardening tell us to clean up the garden and to cut things down in fall and clean up in spring. But really, this is my favorite season in the garden. Personally, like late fall, especially here in Denver, the sun gets so low that it is one of my favorite times of year. The sun has dropped so low on the horizon that it illuminates everything in this golden hour haze, and everything takes on these tawny hues, and it is just a beautiful time. So many of my photographs in the garden are of this time. This is looking out into our step garden, and on the right is a picture of some seed pods of Penstemon grandiflorus dried up, which is one of my favorite structural perennials in the garden. But one of my favorite quotes from one of our inspiring minds in this field is the skeletons of plants for me are as important as the flowers. Another thing he says is, I'm not interested in a plant unless it looks good dead. And I think those are very inspiring ways to think about this, because this structure is not only aesthetic and beautiful and what gives us interest year round, but it is truly what makes our gardens thrive as ecosystems. Another great shot of some coneflowers. And here is Pete Udolph, who I just mentioned. His documentary about his gardening style, Five Seasons, touches on this concept that the fall and winter season really is something we should be thinking about with double the impact each year. And again, these are some photos from our gardens here that I took last season. For me, garden design isn't just about plants, it's about emotion, atmosphere, and a sense of contemplation. And I think for me, that is really what the winter season does for us. I'm gonna pause and take a couple questions now, Elizabeth, if there are any waiting.
Yeah, we've got some recommendations. Just kind of will you be getting to more specific like implementable information later on in the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. So some people are asking about, especially given the low water that we're looking at, I'm sure a lot of our participants are hearing about drought restrictions from their water providers. So
Yeah.
what do they need to know about new plantings this year with the restrictions?
It's a great question. I'm sure that we're all going to have all season long. You know, I will give you some tips today. I think the challenge with new plantings is that they do, of course, require some water to get established. The point of this presentation, and I'm about to get into it further, is to select plants that really need the bare minimum of water, to select plants that are adaptable enough to tolerate inundation and to tolerate many months of drought. And we're going to get into a little bit about thinking about those systems and relinquishing some ideas of what the garden needs to look like year round. I think it's going to be a tough year for new plantings regardless. And one of the practical things I would recommend is using long cycle soak methods. So instead of trying to water or irrigate um, for a short period every couple of days, we would recommend one longer water every 10 days or 14 days. And so for new plants, that can be a challenge, but I think that's where we're going to have to make some compromises this year. And maybe saying, I put in this plant that actually has higher water requirements than I'm able to give it. And maybe letting go a little bit and thinking more about using seed and seed mixes that really don't require much water at all.
Okay. And another one, what was the fifth season? The slide went by too quickly.
It's fall. It's a bit of a trick there. It's fall, winter, spring, summer, fall. And he is kind of referring to the fact of how much value those seasons of dormancy hold in our gardens. It's a great documentary. I highly recommend you watch it.
Great. Okay, I think that's it because if you're going to be getting to, we have some questions about specific plants for southern facing areas, a berm. So I think we'll hold off on those till we get deeper into your exact recommendations.
Yes, sounds great. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So now let's get into a bit of the understanding of why ecology matters in our designs. And I hear you all wanting specifics. I promise I will get there. But the goal of this presentation for me is to really help you develop a deeper understanding of the themes that come into play here. And then plant selection becomes a lot easier when you know where to look for those plants. Um, so the ecology matters in designing our gardens for the future, but not just for us, but for the planet. What would happen to your garden if you walked away tomorrow, if it got no extra water or attention? One of my favorite inspiring characters in this space is Kenton Seth, who talks about planting for the apocalypse and has done a lot of work in the recent years on the western slope of gardens that are getting no supplemental water. So they get a little bit during installation and then they get nothing. And it's been really successful and really interesting to watch. So I want to remind you again and orient you to what we're talking about with the high plains. It's a specific vein of the Great Plains of the North American steppe. And it's the eastern plains of Colorado, but the western half of the Great Plains. It's one of the most arid parts of the country, verging on desert in some areas. And that's the thing with all of these zones is they are many ecoregions that blend together. But here in Colorado, we're also lucky to have tracks of one of the rarest ecosystems on the planet in this area, and that is the sand prairie. And it's remnant of dunes. It's remnants of sand dunes that existed when we had an inland sea many, many millennia ago. But we're going to jump into the high plains of eastern Colorado and western Kansas. Um, this is primarily shortgrass prairie. We have some sections of tall grass prairie. It's semi-arid, 10 to 20 inches of rainfall a year. And this is why it matters. This is why we need to know about these ecosystems and the plants that grow there in order to mimic them in our yards, because rock gardens are great, and taking inspiration from our beautiful alpine environments and all the gorgeous plants that grow there is wonderful. But those plants all have really specific requirements for moisture and a little bit of shade from our incredibly hot temperatures here in the city. So when we're thinking about designing urban spaces, we need to be looking to these incredibly extreme, tough environments where plants can go months without water, especially this, we had, one of the driest years on record. But I will say, let's all say a little prayer for a wet spring. So don't get ahead of yourselves with, we're going to have no water this season. I know we will have restrictions and it will be less, but it's not over yet. We may still have some rain ahead of us. At least I'm trying to remain hopeful. But the photo you see there is of the sand prairie in eastern Colorado, where we do some work with the Nature Conservancy at Fox Ranch Preserve in Yuma County. And these ecosystems are some of the most imperiled on Earth. They have been traditionally converted to agriculture and energy production left and right, even though they're some of the most diverse Ecosystems that we have, and they are some of the most important for replenishing our groundwater and absorbing the water that we do get. So I just want to show you a quick clip of the Eastern Plains here. This is the High Plains meeting the Colorado Piedmont, which sort of is where it comes down from the foothills. And you can see those parcels. You can see how much of this area has been developed into agriculture. You can kind of see the vein of the Arickaree running through that photo on the right, and how some of the last remaining tracts of undeveloped land are tucked in there. And so that is what we here at the gardens are always looking for, is trying to find those underdeveloped areas and study those plant communities and see what's hiding there. Um, as I mentioned, it's shortgrass prairie, tons of sagebrush and sagebrush diversity, and really denoted by the microclimates of bluffs and buttes that come out of this, and then the riparian corridors, of course, where cottonwoods grow along rivers like the Arickaree and Big Sandy and Sand Creek. So the design focus I want us to pull from this is the matrix of grasses, dotted with shrubs, drifts of seasonal perennials, and really the movement that comes in prairies. They can be incredibly beautiful. Our major players are little bluestem, blue grama, prickly pear, and yucca. But I'm here to help dispel the rumor that all that's out there is prickly pear and yucca, because I feel like I hear that so often where I'm like, I love the prairie, and everyone's like, it's just brown and yucca. So let's talk about some of the perennials that we find there. In both of these pictures, there are probably 3 to 6 species of grass you're seeing, really laying the matrix and the foil for what everything else comes up through. On the left, you see some broom snakeweed and dotted gayfeather, Liatris punctata, and Gutierrezia, in a beautiful matrix planting that it just like took my breath away while we were out there. There's big blue or little blue stems, excuse me, and purple threon are sort of in the background there, and of course blue grama. Another photo from some of the dunes in the eastern half of Colorado of our sandhills muley grass and sand sage, or Artemisia filifolia. And just these are supposed to be inspiration. These are supposed to show you what a matrix planting can look like. And it doesn't have to be complex. It can be quite simple. This is maybe 6 to 8 species here that really work together throughout the entire season. We have some sand dropseed and some Indian rice grass in these 2 photos. Again, these are all from the same tract of property, within a mile or so of each other. The diversity of grasses to choose from that can handle months, if not years, of complete drought is truly remarkable. And being able to see the beauty in their structure and not just their green is really important. And again, one of the big areas of design focus I want to pull from today is just the movement that these grasses can have and what that can look like in our gardens. Some beautiful shots of sand blue stem here. And again, I will label all of these for you with Latin and common names. The other major factor of our high plains are the riparian corridors, as I mentioned. And so why I mention these microclimates is I want you to think about this when thinking about your garden. Do you have areas that have a little bit more water naturally? This is like the roof line, the edge of the downspout, areas that are slightly shaded on the north side, or the east side. And so areas that stay shadier tend to stay a little wetter. And so can we select and what we call hydrozone our gardens, to really utilize every drop of water that we are getting? What runs off the side of your driveway? Where can we have a small swale that we can take advantage of that runoff? So it's really important to think about the microclimates in our natural areas as we think about designing our gardens. The other feature I mentioned of the High Plains are these rock outcroppings. All across the High Plains, you see them coming up, traditionally Ogallala limestone and some granite outcroppings as well, where you see decomposed granite. And they create these perfect planting pockets and really amazing little vignettes, where on one section you'll see 3 or 4 species in abundance, and on another section you'll see 3 or 4 different species in abundance. And they're also incredibly seasonal. On the left, you're seeing demi three-nerve daisy, Tetranuris, and oh gosh, what's sandwort? Aramogony hookeri. And within a few weeks, that palette will completely change to some other flowering things in there, like some astragalus, some of the grasses, and some penstemon as well. So I'm going to throw you a few slides here of really bright color, really amazing perennials and annuals that we see on the prairie to help dispel some of those myths. That's all that's out there is grass and yucca and prickly pear. Um, these are Dahlia villosa on the left and Astragalus sericolucus on the right. And just an amazing selection of flowers at every season. These range from early May to late October. We have a pea in the top left, a penstemon in the center, liatris on the right, a macaranthera or tansiaster on the bottom left, and an adorable little annual called Palafox in the middle, and then a thistle, one of our native thistles on the right. And again, just so much color all season long. And it is truly remarkable. Every time we're out there, we think we've seen it all, and we find new things blooming at every time of year. Okay, so the mashup here, it's our high plains meets our high desert. We're talking about both because we have so much to learn from both of these ecosystems. The high plains, as we just talked about, is on our right of the Rocky Mountains here. And then the high desert is most of the area to the left of the Rocky Mountains, the Great Basin, the Colorado Plateau, and really down into some of the canyons of southeastern Colorado as well. So these are cold deserts. That's why it's important for us. They're not the warm deserts. They're deserts that get very cold. And so the plants that we look to from there are incredibly hardy. These areas can range from like -15 up to 105, 110 degrees. And so what better place to look for drought adapted plants than these cold deserts, semi-arid, dry, montane areas, pinyon, juniper, woodlands. And these areas will receive seasonal flooding, so plants that can tolerate some inundation, and then they get most of their moisture in winter, of course. And again, a great graphic showing how important the root systems of our native plants are comparatively. This is a shot of the high desert in New Mexico, right on the New Mexico border, the Guadalupe Mountains. And so these areas are what we call scrub, or like really short trees, oak trees, juniper trees, tall shrubs, shrublands, some shorter shrubs called subshrubs, and cushion plants. Tons of cacti and succulents, of course, all with an array of adaptations to live in these incredibly extreme environments. The picture on the left is actually one of the northernmost populations of Joshua tree that exists in South Central Utah. And the one on the right is a banana yucca from that same area. Just a quick slide showing really the adaptations that occur in these places and how beautiful they can be. And again, how functional. So on the right, I'm sorry, on the left, you'll see some leaf adaptations that include being covered with small, fine hairs and also really reduced. And this is all for water conservation. The less surface area for transpiration, the less water they're losing. And those hairs actually help collect moisture in the air and condense it into droplets that can be absorbed. We see spines and hairs of all varieties on cacti and shrubs. We see photosynthetic stems, so plants that actually have no leaves, but instead have stems that can photosynthesize, like our ephedra there on the right. And then these plants are built for longevity. They use a strategy called dual root strategy, which means they have one taproot and a ton of surface roots. And this allows for them to pull moisture up from the groundwater table and utilize surface level moisture. And so that actually helps other plants around them grow as well. That shot in the middle on the bottom there is an amazing grass that actually As the center dies out, it continues growing outward. And so those plants are decades old, if not longer, really built for longevity and really minimal resource use. Not that they're the most beautiful, but they're quite remarkable. And then, of course, those spines on the hematocactus are just unbelievable. And what are those for? What are the spines for? Those are all anti-predation mechanisms. These environments are where all sorts of herbivores get hungry, long periods of drought, and plants have evolved these incredible armatures to prevent things from eating them. This is a shot from central Utah, right outside Canyonlands. Um, and again, just documenting the way that the high desert environment, as opposed to being primarily grasslands, is primarily a shrubland with bunch grasses dotted in between. And this is another design aesthetic we can utilize. The structure of survival. I'm going to go on a bit of a podium here about shrubs and how great they are. Two of my amazing colleagues wrote the book Shrouded in Light, Kevin Williams and Michael Geedy, all about how we should be using shrubs in our Western gardens. And I just want to tell you a little bit about why. What is the difference between grasses and shrubs? And shrubs are remarkable life forms for adaptation. They have many stems as opposed to a tree, which has one single stem. If that stem dies, most likely the tree is going to die back, or have to utilize all of its resources in order to build a new stem. Shrubs, however, have many stems so that they have their eggs in many baskets. One stem gets eaten, broken, dies back. They can make new ones. The other ones are all going to be photosynthesizing. As I mentioned, they have reduced leaves and photosynthetic stems often, and they function as nurse plants. As I mentioned, they are able to pull water up from the groundwater table and can provide moisture for plants that have more shallow root systems. They provide shade, they lessen surface level evaporation, and they draw in other mammals, birds, reptiles. And so those things bring seeds and fruits with them and create these little fertility islands of biodiversity. Also, because of their form, they're incredibly grazable and can recover from that. So they are able to be a food source without being completely depleted of their resources. One of my favorite quotes that Kevin and Michael wrote was, in part, shrubs become caretakers of other plants because they are first caretakers of other creatures. Birds and mammals rest, nest, and feed in their branches and root systems, carrying and dropping seeds that find nooks in the organic duff beneath which to germinate. A fitting synergy that has earned shrubs and shrublands the designation of fertility islands. So as you can see here, some great desert shrubs. Although they may not look alive, they very much are. And you can see again how they're acting as nurse plants for those other more shallowly rooted plants to live below them. Here are some amazing flowers on shrubs. I feel like shrubs get a bad rap for not being super attractive, but these are some of our most common and most sturdy Southwest desert shrubs. And I will get to a list of them, I promise. It's all on here and on your handout. Um, and then I just want to show some what we call drought deciduous plants. And so this is, of course, the ocotillo, which comes from a little bit further south in some of our warmer deserts. But it's one of the best examples of drought deciduous, in which its stems will grow and flower every season, maybe multiple times a year, with not a leaf on them, because as you can see in the background, they're almost green. They're incredibly photosynthetic. But when it does rain anytime throughout the year, they will put out leaves and perform photosynthesis while they have those resources. And then as soon as it dries out again, they will drop those leaves. They're not losing that water. And so it's a really amazing cycle to see. And one of the first times I saw it was driving south, where I saw completely dry, brown, got further south where there had been some rain, a few leaves, and then all the way into the basins, and they were completely green, filled with leaves. And that can happen several times throughout the year. And that is the ocotillo is one example, but many shrubs do this. One of our most common in our area that does this is the Utah service berry, or Amelanchier utahensis. The other feature of high deserts that we can bring into our garden design is bold, succulent structure and beauty. And a lot of us are kind of resistant to some of the cacti. Um, they are mean, they are painful sometimes, but they are also incredible elements of design and really some of the showiest flowers that we have here in the West that we're so lucky to be able to grow. And a few shots just of some floral displays in different high desert environments that I have been to from, West Central Colorado all the way to Canyonlands and south to the Four Corners region. The diversity is truly staggering. And one of my favorite things about these environments is that each season there's a different display based on moisture, based on seeding that season. Which brings me to Death Valley this year is having one of the most remarkable displays ever. That picture on the right is from Death Valley, which is high desert verging on the cooler, warmer, or verging on the warmer deserts to the south. And then the photo on the left is High Plains, Eastern Colorado. Um, and so they both really have these super blooms, we call them, which are cycles of moisture followed by massive seed germination, frequently of annual plants or of short-lived biennials and perennials. So in a few weeks, they can perform their entire life cycle, germinate, grow, flower, and then eventually die back as things dry out. And then a few to throw you off that like these environments are very similar, and this is a grassland in the middle of the high desert. And similarly, this is what I would call high desert in the middle of the southern Great Plains. So just to review this mashup, we have the high plains and the high desert, both steppe environments. And this is a visually lush but physiologically lean design aesthetic. And so we want it to feel like a beautiful, vibrant, full garden without having to put inputs in. We rarely need to amend the soil. If anything, we're going to add inorganic material like a stone mulch, a pea gravel, a shale, as opposed to adding compost. We're going to let plants do their thing. They can grow in these really harsh, compacted soils. It involves using grasses as a matrix, large drifts of perennials throughout that matrix, shrubs as anchors, leaving some bare ground. And I'm going to get into specifics on all of these here. So here comes the drier portion where I'm going to talk about why we're planting for the future. And here's some of the specifics for the toolkit that y'all are looking for. Let me get my notes here. Okay. So again, what would happen if you turned off your water tomorrow? If we only had enough for our clean drinking water in our house, the garden is low priority. We're gonna have to be recycling gray water, catching rainwater. What would happen to your garden if that was the case? And so we really want to create gardens that are low input and high impact. We're thinking about that supplemental water being something that needs to happen for 3, 4 weeks and then it's cut back. And, this is ideally by hand. You're watering specific new things. And then as we get a month out, we're cutting back and watering once every couple weeks, and really letting things sort of their way into existence. We want to cultivate tough plants. When we provide too much supplemental water and when we provide compost, we're giving these plants more than they need. And that's how we end up with tall, floppy plants and plants that are more aggressive or reproducing at a faster rate than they would. And I see this a lot in our gardens here with plants that I have in my cottonwood border, which actually receives a decent amount of supplemental water because the cottonwoods suck it all up. But we have some of the same species in our plains garden where they're much better behaved, much less aggressive, and have a completely different stature where they're only getting natural rainwater. Um, and when we're talking about, as I was mentioning, we're talking about amending, so that low input, we really want to amend as little as possible. We want to choose plants that can thrive in these degraded sites, even if it's been, compacted with construction, even if you have a hard clay pan, there are plants that will do that. And it's about finding those plants and often about using seeds and seed mixes to let the plants dictate who's happy where. Plants will germinate in these environments, and you just have to look to some of our urban wastelands to see that like plants do it all the time. They grow out of cracks in the concrete, they grow out of sites that need remediation. So they're smarter than we give them credit for. And sometimes we just have to be a little patient and throw a few different things at the wall. Um, the other really important thing is hydrozoning. And this can mean a few different things. But really, one of the biggest things is choosing plants with similar water requirements and placing them near each other. And so it doesn't mean that you're relegated to choosing only desert drought tolerant plants. It means find the areas in your yard where you might be able to utilize plants that need a little bit of shade and that need a little bit more water, and group those together, and then group your xeric desert plants together in the other places. And so if you are having to provide supplemental water, you're only having to do it in one or two places at a time. Um, and I'll get into that, but we're going to utilize topography in that as well. The other piece of hydrozoning is auditing your irrigation. So you can have your irrigation company do this and come out and walk you through it, but you need to watch it regularly to see where it's hitting and how effective it is. Have sprinkler heads gotten moved or blocked or turned in the wrong direction and they're really spraying the road? Um, it is really important to check in on your irrigation. And oftentimes it's running overnight when we're not able to see it. So it's important to make sure you run it while you can like don't change your schedule, but go out there one evening and run it while you're there to see what's actually happening if it's not something you're watching regularly. And then, yeah, you can have your company come out, or if you do it yourself, cut back zones that don't need as much water. It's unlikely that your whole garden needs the exact same amount of water. And so, really using zonal irrigation to say, okay, this zone could use one extra supplemental water a month, and this other zone probably only needs watering once every 15 days or once every 20 days. Um, and consider, as I was mentioning, using one long cycle soak method. So every 10 to 14 days, we're going to do a long, deep soak at an hour plus irrigation, or hand watering, however many gallons per minute that your flow rate is. You want to be giving plants ideally like a long cycle soak would be like an inch of water, an inch or two of water. And then consider, as I mentioned, watering by hand, only things that need a little bit more love. And then one of the things I do here at the gardens often is experiment with letting your gardens dry out. And I know we're like always afraid that plants are going to die or we're going to lose them, but watch it and watch for what we call indicator plants or plants that flag or wilt. So for example, I take care of the nexus sperm, which is all cacti and succulents and really hot heat tolerant perennials. And I will let that garden go without irrigating it for 10 days, 15 days, and start to see what's looking upset, what's looking sad. And for me, it's usually my hummingbird mint or my agastache. And as soon as that starts to wilt or flag, I'm like, okay, it's time to give it a soak. And some years that's longer than others. And so it's about sort of getting to know your plants and what you can learn from them. And then like maybe we let it lean out. Maybe we make choices to let some of those less tolerant plants die off in favor of some of those tougher plants surviving and reseeding. I think those are the choices when we talk about gardening for the future that we need to be more comfortable making, are those experimental, maybe these ones that need a little bit more babying don't have a place in this garden. The next piece is using inorganic elements. So using rocks, boulders, and stone mulch. And sometimes hardscaping can be expensive. So it's really good to just get creative. There's a ton of inorganic material out there. If you know where to look, you can get on Facebook Marketplace, free trade. But lots of different things can work for providing this type of crevice environment. One of the other things we're hoping to do with big inorganic elements is create thermal mass. And so that is, rock that gets warmed by the sun all day, then holds that heat and warms the soil around it for, the night and weeks to come, especially as we get into some of our colder seasons. And so really getting creative with inorganic elements. I'm going to show you some examples of all of these. Lastly, or one of the last things is earthworks and really, not being afraid. I'm going to do this in a couple of my gardens this year, but creating topography, creating complexity is one of the best things we can do for our gardens. So dig a low-lying swale in one area and use that soil to create a berm in another area. And the plants you can plant in that swale will be completely different than the plants that are going to want to be on the berm. And that is the way we can really create complexity and interest in gardens and utilize all of the water we have. That swale will catch extra irrigation, it'll catch rainwater, it can be coming off of a downspout or a roof edge. And really starting to think about manipulating the earth in ways to our advantage. And that can be terracing, can be creating crevices. There are so many options. And then lastly, a thing that's really important and is often missed in commercial landscaping and residential is like planting small. Often in our industry, we use what are called plugs, which are a 2-inch wide and usually 5-inch deep tray of 30 or 50 plants. And planting plugs is incredibly valuable because those smaller plants have a much easier time adapting to their new environment and usually develop stronger root systems quicker. Additionally, if you depth, you're filling in a much smaller hole than if you were planting, 10 1-gallon plants or 50 2-inch plants. If two or three of your 50 die, you probably won't even notice. But if two or three of your 10 die, you're going to have a big hole. And then planting in layers. So we really want to make sure we're thinking about every layer of the garden. And that's one of the ways we can really reduce that urban heat island effect too, is having ground covers, forbs, shrubs, and small trees where appropriate. And then again, that creates complexities for wildlife as well. Here, I'm going to just show you a few examples of those things I talked about. And so this is from, I think this is High Plains Environmental Center, with Eriogonum is the yellow sulfur-flowered buckwheat. We have some Artemisia, that silver princess plume in the background there, some asters and some California poppy, of course. And so the play of the inorganic and the self-sowing annuals creates such a rhythm in the garden. Next is a shot. This is from Arizona. This is a home garden in Arizona where we have really worked with topography to create a pool. That's probably a big pool for this year, probably be a dry pool. And then these terraces, which allow you to have different planting zones again, different levels of shade, and really capture some of that water in specific places. And then again, with this rock and the inorganic elements, you create a lot of thermal mass where you can grow some of those more heat-loving things up against them. Okay, I'm going to get into a few plants again. This will be a full list on the handout, and I'm happy to always talk specifics further. I didn't want to be overwhelming. I think one of the things that's important to remember in naturalistic gardening and ecological horticulture is like sometimes simple is better. Start with 4 or 5 species, and you can really work some magic early on, and then edit and add things as you want to later. On the right is an example of a design I did for a right-of-way, or a hell strip, as we lovingly call them, the area between the sidewalk and the street. And this is under some hackberry trees that have been there for ages and in a full sun exposed area, where we took basically the same palette. And so you can see the matrix is those soft tan X's and triangles are my grasses. They're kind of everywhere, especially on that southern smaller section. You'll see all blue grama, or sorry, little blue stem. And then the other interesting things I've just dotted throughout those grasses, and that creates a really cohesive design. And so on the left is that planting in the first season. Again, we used all plugs and small plants for this. I think the largest we used was like a 3.5-inch pot or quart, except for some of the shrubs, which were, of course, in 1 and 2 gallons. Um, and you can see how quickly things fill in and adapt. And we did top dress this area with a squeegee mulch or like a pea gravel. Um, and the one on the right is by the second year. Halfway through the summer, you'll see our Agastache rupestris or hummingbird mint is going strong on the left side of that image. And again, this is in a competitive environment under a hackberry on a roadside, so much trash in it all the time. But really, this will be self-sustaining. Sure, there will be weeds that come up in it, but these communities will be competitive enough to hold their own. A couple other examples of grass matrices and design. So the right is our plains garden and the left is the cottonwood border. And again, that's blue grama in most of those. In the back of the other one, you can see western wheatgrass in the back of the plains there. And again, you can see the grasses are really the foil for which everything else comes through, and it creates a really nice continuity throughout the season. Here's a shot of our water smart garden. And part of my goal today is to show you that not all of these naturalistic, ecological, drought tolerant dynamic gardens have to look the same. There's so many different styles that we can apply these plants to. So this is the Water Smart Garden here at Denver Botanic Gardens, and that's feathered grass you're seeing, a stipa or a nacella that is really showy in this frame. And then a similar shot from a little bit later when the muley grass has really started to get going. And so although they're not the dominant matrix in this planting, they can really stand out and tie the garden together with a little bit of rhythm throughout the space. And again, just to take our cues from nature, this is a shot of Mesa Verde National Park, high elevation, incredibly dry, in the shade. We have our prairie June grass in full bloom, and there were some astragalus and penstemon coming up through it. There's a shrub layer of Utah serviceberry that's flowering sort of in the foreground and the background, and then the juniper and pinyon overstory. Okay, some shrubs as we get into um, plants to live by. I'm like realizing I'm running out of time a little bit, so I'm gonna move quickly through this stuff. You will again have all of these for access afterwards. But shrubs are the bones. These are really what can hold the garden together and can provide, as I mentioned, shelter and water for everything else. There's a great list there. Here's some examples of our shrublands. That is Artemisia and buckwheat, rabbit brush out at Pawnee Buttes, our sagebrush, sand sage, and pink muley grass, or sand muley, I'm sorry. And then some of our creosote scrub as we get into Utah, creosote and ambrosia. And these are some shots from gardens where we have rabbit brush, chokecherry, physocarpus all working together. Bush and rabbit brush with some yucca in the foreground and penstemon in the background. Oh, sorry. And then getting into the structure of these gardens. So really using those succulents and cacti, as I mentioned, to just pop throughout the space. We have a great selection of cold hardy cacti and succulents to choose from. I've included a couple books at the end of the presentation for reference. But we can get creative and use them in pots as well. This agave americana is barely hardy here, and we would like it to put on size. So we bring it in and put it out in a pot each year. Not necessarily practical for every homeowner to have a giant agave. But here are some shots both from Kelly Grumman's garden of cold hardy cactus on the left and the Nexus berm on the right, where you can see how we can use those textures and colors in a really nice contrasting way throughout the season. Another shot of the Water Smart garden in winter. We have a primrose or Enithera cespitosa in the front there with some hedgehog cactus cultivars and a prickly pear, hesperaloe or false aloe, and our bear grass in the background there. Those are again from the Nexus berm. Again, flowering perennials, we all know and love them. They're important because they are resilient and they're tough. And they are some of the best resources for our local pollinators. And so, including a diversity of flowering perennials is how we're going to have the really resilient resources that move around season to season. These are some shots from Dryland Mesa. Again, a completely unirrigated garden. This was after a period of intense drought last year, and or maybe 2024. And they're just doing their thing that you would never know. This is Water Smart Garden, our prairie flax, gazania, and California poppies. This is Sacred Earth Garden. Again, no supplemental water. We're seeing sagebrush there in the background, penstemon, prairie flax, and helianthus in the foreground. And then cleome coming in as well, bee plant, one of our favorite annuals. Then we have some penstemon, salvias, and asclepias here in this photo, some of the best genera for our pollinators. And that mirabilis multiflora in the foreground with primroses, fringed sage, and butterfly milkweed. And then the last category I wanted to put in a plug for is really the seeding annuals and biennials. And the way that they move through the garden creates such charisma, spontaneity, these moments of fun. This has been one of my favorite additions to the Nexus berm in particular, but ones I have really been self-sowing in all of my gardens. Just sow them and see what happens. You know, you can water the areas you've sowed them, but sometimes they just need one rain later on and they'll be popping up. Or maybe a few years from now, they'll come up. So it's a really interesting way to add a little bit of dynamic nature to our gardens. Here's just some great shots of different annuals that come up in the garden. We have Euphorbia marginata or snow on the mountain on the left, the Palafoxia again up top, and Cleome on the bottom. One of my favorite inspirations for annuals and biennials is roadside. So these were some roadside shots in Central Texas and just phenomenal plant communities of, literal side of the road. They're getting a little bit more water because of the runoff, but really tough plant communities. I wanted to showcase a little bit of the work we're doing at our Chatfield Farms garden for things like this. These are some test plots that Michael Geedy has been working on using long-lived perennials that have been planted and then oversowed with shorter, quicker to establish and annuals, biennials, and short-lived perennials. And so this is the second season, and you can just see the diversity in a really low input, low maintenance, low cost planting. And so we'll have more to come on that, but a little bit of a teaser on some of the research we're working on. Okay, I'm gonna continue to blow through these and then I'll take questions. Um, the dynamic maintenance mindset. So this is a piece I just want to touch on again, kind of like changing how we think about these spaces. So abandoning perfection. This is never going to be finished. It's a work in progress. Again, could you walk away tomorrow? And this is one we all struggle with, but plants are going to do what they want to do. They're going to move, they're going to self-sow, they're going to die, they'll fill in despite our best efforts. And can we find joy in those moments? Can we learn from them and learn to edit around them? And the reason we're doing this is to create dynamic gardens that can tolerate extremes. So, in 2023, I believe it was, we got down to like -22, and up to 67 or 70, all within like a 48-hour window. Can we create gardens that can withstand that? Like no plant should have to withstand that, but it happens. And so every season will be different. Some season you may have a prevalence of your California poppy or your foxtail barley annual plants that have been so happy. Other years, you might not see them at all. You might have perennials where you had one year growing up under a shrub and then it set seed, and the following year you have 30 of them. Or a plant that's getting too much water and has spread by rhizomes across the whole garden. These things all happen, and I think we should think about being okay with them and approaching them more with curiosity rather than control. And the last piece is like the window of tolerance. Like it's your garden. It can be as tame and tidy or as chaotic and wild as you want. And experiment with that and know that it is a process as we go. I think the soft garden, strong borders I put at the bottom there. It's another tome of John Little, which is like creating these wild ecosystems. But as humans, we still really want that idea of intention and order. And so create a meadow, but put a really beautiful, strong border on it using, sticks or woven willow or pieces of wood that are upright. Like get creative with how you can border a space with intention. And it isn't all or nothing. Like I've given you so much information today, so many different ways of doing this, but like start with a small corner or leave one of your edges completely untouched for the season and see what happens. What life comes in, what happens to the leaves? Do they break down? Um, Experiment. And so these are some great examples of these plantings. This is a buffalo grass lawn. This is a border with penstemon and grandiflorus and sneezeweed in the background there. And these are beds I have let dry out. So these are some of the driest beds in the garden comparatively to some of the ones on the north side that are receiving more water. This is Don and Donnie Barnett's garden in Pueblo, Colorado, primarily cacti and succulents, no supplemental water, and some really great self-sowing annuals and perennials. Another home garden in Pueblo using terracing and bold structure. Chipungu Sculpture Park is up in Loveland, Colorado, managed by High Plains Environmental Center. And they've taken amazing plant palettes and put them in a really like traditional urban landscape setting. This is one of my favorite inspirational gardens, Summer Home Garden. It's a little pocket park that Lisa Negri and Kevin Phillip Williams have developed and designed. A really low water, um, dynamic garden that is like always a riot with color and texture. Again, this garden in Arizona. This is the Undaunted Garden up in Fort Collins at Gardens on Spring Creek. This was designed originally by Lauren Springer and still managed by her along with their staff. Again, our seed plots. And lastly, just a recap of why it matters. It's not gardens for the future. This is gardens for now. I think it's never been more appropriate as it is this season when we have seen historically low snowpacks, historically dry winters. So take a moment to appreciate the aesthetics of what plants do to survive. Marvel at the adaptations. They're drought deciduous. The fact that they might go dormant in the middle of the summer. The fact that some plants will flower prolifically and then die as a last ditch effort. Plants that have character and a less than perfect look. These transient moments of ephemera when one plant is really prolific but then dies back. And a lot of these plants have great foliage and like few flowers, and that's okay too. But use these characteristics in design contrast and remember that it's the function rather than the aesthetics that we should find really beautiful about these spaces. Lastly, it's about ecological stewardship and services. And you'll notice I prioritize the stewardship for non-human, but also showcase the services for human. First and foremost, these spaces have to be aesthetic. They do have to be beautiful. We're people, we like pretty things. And if they're not beautiful, we're not going to reach as many people as we want to with these dynamic spaces. But they also provide water conservation, cool our urban areas, require less inputs, and really connect us to our community. And resilience is local. In these, as I mentioned, dark and trying times, we have been thinking about and talking about resilience a lot and what that looks like. And so keeping in mind that these spaces really help us facilitate our relationship to our local ecology and not only the plant and animal life, but the people. And one of my favorite things about talking with my volunteer groups who are working on a lot of this in their own yards is how they tell me all their neighbors stop to chat with them about what's going on and watching their bee hotel and seeing the monarchs on the milkweed. So it is a really amazing way to connect with our local community and our non-human community as well. That I know was a lot of information. That is all I have for you. My last few slides are some required reading, but Elizabeth, why don't you let me know what questions we have?
Okay, we got quite a few questions. I'll try to kind of group them a little bit, as you can imagine. So one question kind of covers soil amendments. So we've got someone in Weld County who's got very compacted dry soil. Um,
Mhm.
so what are the thoughts in regard to xeric, so native plants and soil amendments, even in dry compacted soil?
Exactly. So think about the desert, think about the plains. The soil there is dry and compacted. There are very few areas that we need to come in and add organic matter to. I think the most common thing that we're doing here is top dressing with an inorganic mulch. So again, like a pea gravel, a squeegee, a shale. There's all sorts of different stone mulches you can get if you go to your local stone yard. All different colors. The most important piece is keeping it at a really small diameter. So not ever using that like 1 inch to 2 inch stone. We really want to keep it at like a third to a quarter to an eighth inch. And I say that because when we plant, we can use it to amend the planting hole. And so we can just mix in good drainage in the root zone surrounding the plant. We don't need to amend the entire garden. Um, as you add, as you plant, as you move things, that mulch on top will get mixed in and will create better drainage. But in that case, I would plant a few perennials and things and amend their planting holes and then direct sow anything else you want on top of that dry, compacted soil and see what happens because things can grow in that.
Great, thank you. And then any recommendations for shade shrubs and grasses? We have some people who are interested in, and I did put a link
Yes.
to CSU Extension as well as Front Range Wild Ones for resources for
Yes.
people for that specific question, but wondering off the top of your head if you had any.
Yeah, it comes up all the time. I'm actually having my seasonal work on a report for dry shade this year. We're going to dive in deep in the urban areas and in the gardens here to see what really thrives in our dry shade because it is the most asked question all the time. There are a few for me that come up, which is rus, our sumacs, so both trilobata and aromatica, our golden currant, ribes aureum, um, wild crabapple is on my list. That is not a super common one, but it is available out there. Paraphyllum ramosissimum. Gorgeous crabapple flowers on a petite shrub, really tolerates dry shade. Um, and then there are a slew of perennials that will do it, which is like Eriogonum umbellatum, some of our buckwheats, and Penstemon strictus, our Rocky Mountain beard tongue, does dry shade really well. Penstemon grandiflorus will do a little bit more dappled shade. It'll kind of move itself around to find those little corners of shade. There are some sedges and grasses that will do dry shade just fine. The blue grandma typically will tolerate a good amount of shade as well. Um, and let's see what else off the top of my head. There are many more. We're working on like a chaparral seed mix as well. But I would say like look more towards some of those grasses that are in the more montane environments.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's
I'll work on
see.
a full presentation for dry shade for us
Yeah,
though.
I'm sure everybody would love that. I'm sure everybody would love that. This is a question. I know that annuals reseed themselves but will they do it if the mulch is too thick? I know it's very specific.
No, that's a great question. And again, one of the reasons we recommend using like an inorganic mulch. And so the thing with using an organic mulch is that you're not typically laying a new layer every year. So those annuals should come up, set seed down in all those little crevices, and that's where they're happiest. It's where they'll get a little bit of extra moisture from the condensation on that rock mulch. And so, like, if you're putting down a really thick layer of wood mulch on top of some of those things, then maybe. But typically, a layer of rock mulch will allow light to penetrate, and those seedlings will grow right through it.
And then we had another question. Could you go back to your recommended reading slide again? But also keep
Yes,
in mind, everybody, that you will be getting this deck tomorrow. So you're going
yes.
to get Laura's entire presentation and she's going to label all the plants for you so you'll know exactly what you're looking for. And then I'm trying, oh, this is kind of an interesting question about the mulch, about squeegee and the smaller rocks, about wouldn't they also scorch plants in the summer if the rocks hold on to heat? Is that why we're getting them so small?
No, usually it's like a lighter color mulch. But there has been like preliminary research on this topic, and you're not getting scorching with like the rock mulch that's available. Even some of the darker rock mulch is like primarily light in color, a light gray. And so it's not quite the same as you like if you had black rocks, which maybe are getting warmer, but typically the porosity in there is really helping with that as well.
And we have we had a couple of fire resistant questions. And I think that, hopefully everyone's aware of that 5 foot mitigation that really you don't want to plant anything within 5 feet of your house, regardless.
Yes.
Nothing
Yes.
is truly fireproof, but I'm wondering if you have any plants that you think are just a little less fire hazard. I know junipers are something to avoid. Anything else?
Yeah. A lot of our succulents and shrubs are less fire prone. Succulents, obviously, it has to be like an incredibly hot fire to ever burn through succulents. But what I will refer you to actually is this is not something I have spent a lot of time on here at the Botanic Gardens and not being a homeowner myself. But there is a gentleman, Derek Low-Strutter, who presented for us recently at the Landscaping with Colorado Native Plants Conference, and he spoke to that in a lot of his presentation. And those recordings are available online. And yeah, I don't feel comfortable answering that off the top of my head, but it is very
We
important, obviously.
Yeah, so please sign up. We have a fire resilient landscaping
Yeah.
webinar on Wednesday, April 22nd from 6:30 to 8 p.m. So go out to our website. I'll go ahead and pop the link right in the chat and everyone can go. It's on April 22nd. You can sign up for that and learn more. I think we do two of them every year. So I'm looking.
You guys have such amazing seminars. It's such a wonderful resource that I'm always
Well,
pointing
make sure
folks
you make
to.
sure you tell your tell all those sponsors that you saw on that slide how much you appreciate it because without them this would not happen. Um,
Exactly.
Somebody asked about comments on drip systems. I think we're actually at the end of the webinar, and I don't want people to get frustrated because they have to drop off. So we do have resources on on our website about smart controllers, greenhouses, nurseries, etc.
Exactly.
If you would like to check out our website. Um, but otherwise, thank you so much, Laura, for your time
Yeah.
today.
And please feel free to reach out to me. My email is here on the deck and Laura.Swain at Botanic Gardens. If you have any follow-up questions, I'm happy to spend some time answering them. And happy planting.
Yeah, I hope you
Everyone
all.
do your rain
Oh,
dances.
yep. I hope you all learned as much as I did and feel empowered to start using some of these ideas and thoughts that Laura presented. Thank you again for attending. Our seminar season runs through August, and you can always register for more. Thank you again, and have a lovely rest of your day.